Good morning, everybody. I apologize for not being there in person, at least virtually, at the time. The severe weather that's coming through Alabama has affected my teaching schedule. So that instead of having time to present this morning, I'm now in the classroom teaching my students. But I did want to go ahead and be able to still be a part of this, and thank you to the organizers who are allowing me to pre-record my presentation for this morning. My presentation is looking at, from a more historical perspective, what sort of lessons can we learn from the commercial birth of the commercial aviation industry, particularly in the 1910s, 1920s, 1930s. Um, Before I get any further, though, I do want to go ahead and give the general government disclaimer that my views that I present this morning are entirely my own and are not necessarily reflective of the DoD or any of its affiliates. So, the legalese being out of the way, we can move on to the more interesting things. And as many people have already previously noted, there are a lot of parallels between aviation and space, particularly in the early 20th century. Not only were the planes small and the technology rather rudimentary, it was a very dangerous proposition to be out there flying. There were even weather concerns because you couldn't fly in harsh weather, just like you can't launch in harsh weather today. And just as NASA and the rest of the government is thinking now about how to regulate and promote commercial space flight, there was a really big question, particularly in the 1920s, of what role the government had in promoting commercial aviation. So I think looking at some of this history is really valuable. But before I get too far in, I do want to sort of offer my definition of commercial space flight. And I've taken a little bit more of a broader view here. I've been looking at definitions of Chinese commercial spaceflight lately, and I think it's really interesting how commercial applies differently in different environments. So I'm taking a bit more broader of a view in terms of commercial being space-related services or products sold by a non-government actor. And so that's kind of what I'm taking commercial space to be. For my purposes here, though, when I talk about space flight, that can mean a lot of things as well. But because of the human element that's involved in aviation, for the most part, when I talk about comparisons between commercial air and commercial space, I am sort of referring mostly to human space flight. Because there is that sort of human element that makes doing a lot of these things a little bit more difficult and tricky, and certainly makes safety a paramount concern in both of these instances. And so I have really kind of four categories to talk about: how we organize, how we regulate, how we promote infrastructure, and how government can go ahead and use subsidies in a strategic way to promote commercial aviation and spaceflight. So in the first case, in terms of organization, there really was a lack of organization for commercial air moving into the 1920s. Aviation coming out of World War I was in a poor state. Very few aviation companies existed. A lot of them went out of business following the drop off in government business post World War I. There were also a variety of government agencies involved in the aviation industry at that point, including the Postal Service, the War Department, Department of Commerce, and even NASA's predecessor, NACA. And so there were really this web of agencies. And what really becomes important in the 1920s in terms of organization is Herbert Hoover, who becomes Secretary of Commerce in the early 1920s. And he had this very associationalist view of what role the government could play in promoting commerce. He really uh, saw his role as bringing industry and government together and seeing how the two could work in tandem to promote commerce and the economy. And he became very influential in the aviation industry and really promoted some of the early legislative efforts that lead to more formal organizing for commercial air in the United States. Including two laws in the mid 1920s that moved to privatize airmail, which had been previously run by the post office, and then set up some some way of formally regulating aviation and establishing regulations within the Department of Commerce itself. And so Hoover really sets up some of these early forms of regulation within commerce. And this works pretty well for a while. But as 1930s moves on, as it's the situation with the airmail becomes a little bit more sketchy in a way, and how subsidies are being used. By the mid 1930s, it starts to become apparent that this web of agencies that had worked okay up till that point was no longer sufficient. And so by then, you get the Civil Aeronautics Authority, which starts to bring all of these agencies together. And there's a very similar situation for spaceflight today, where there is, again, a variety of agencies involved with this, everybody from the FAA to the Department of Commerce to the FCC, the DoD, the State Department in a lot of, in some cases, and it's working okay. Yes, there have been some questions about the FAA and their regulation of launch procedures of late, despite some moves towards streamlining it. But has generally worked okay. But aviation's example suggests that this might not work for much longer. And it might be time and at some point necessary to think about how to centralize all of these different roles and authorities under one agency. And certainly we see something similar happening with the establishment of the Space Force within the Department of Defense as well. So in terms of regulations then, in the 1920s for aviation, one of the big things that the industry, one of their big items that they found important was the need to demonstrate safety. The barnstormers of the era were, while driving a lot of enthusiasm and excitement, really also demonstrated just how unsafe flying was. So in the 1920s, the aviation industry was actually very active in promoting government regulation, particularly towards advancing safety. They also were looking for the federal government to step in so that you wouldn't have different regulations across all 50 states. And again, a very similar situation for spaceflight, although there are probably a little bit more regulations for spaceflight today than there were for aviation in the 1920s. And one of the interesting areas in terms of regulating for commercial spaceflight has been the desire to limit the amount of regulations so as not to sort of put the kibosh on any growing industry. And we have seen that sort of come to a head recently with SpaceX in particular. And I actually think this case is really interesting from the perspective of barnstorming even. With SpaceX testing its Starship down in Texas, you get thousands of people tuning in for these webcasts to hopefully see a good launch and a good test. But the past couple of tests have all ended in sort of, I won't say disaster, because they do actually do have a fair amount of success, but they have ended in some fireballs, shall we say. And when you have so many people tuning into these things, even though there isn't anybody on board and nobody's died through these tests, it does start to sort of question, is this a safe thing? And so while there is this sort of desire to hold back from any excessive regulation that would stifle the industry, there is probably a need to focus on safety, much like the commercial aviation industry did in the 1920s. And the result for them was that there was public confidence in what they were doing and public confidence in flying, and an increase in civilian aviation. And so that might be one thing to at least keep in mind in this battle over regulating commercial spaceflight. Another thing that was really important for the aviation industry in the 1920s was the establishment of infrastructure that would allow them to fly safely. These included navigational aids, maps, runways, beacons. None of these things existed. As the Postal Service began its airmail service in 1918, they started to put some of this into effect to great benefit. And this is really some of the foundational aspects that allowed the commercial aviation industry to grow. And so a similar thing will be necessary for space, but maybe not necessarily in launch, because we already have a lot of sites that do that. We also have the establishment of a number of commercial spaceports. But in terms of things like space situational awareness and traffic management, the United States in particular is already doing some of this with the Space Surveillance Network. Some of the recent space policy directives also called for both SSA and STM services to be concentrated within the Department of Commerce itself. So there are some efforts at this, but because space is a collective good and a global good at that, we are likely to need some more international agreements that can kind of really can be authoritative in these areas, that also allow for safe operations of commercial players in orbit. So infrastructure developments will be necessary to help commercial players operate safely, and also to instill confidence in those who are thinking about taking a trip into orbit. Finally, I want to talk a little bit about the role of federal subsidies, because this was really vital to commercial aviation, and particularly in the form of airmail contracts. Airmail contracts in the 1920s were used to not only support commercial aviation, but to stimulate demand. And so government officials really wanted to design a way of paying companies to fly the mail, but in a way that made them also want to fly passengers. And there's a very clear parallel here with the COTS program, with NASA's commercial program, and the cargo contracts to the International Space Station. But we really do think need to think beyond this. How can we move beyond transporting cargo and now humans to the International Space Station, to how we can structure payments to stimulate commercial demand? So what are we using space for? Is it, the ISS won't be around forever. So is it lunar development? Is it lunar trips? Is it lunar cargo? One of the interesting things here is obviously NASA with its SLS might actually be something of a competitor, much like the space shuttle was. As I'm sure we'll talk about here throughout the symposium, commercial development really comes to a head with as the space shuttle program is ending. So there might be this transition period where NASA might think about moving back towards a NACA model to support research and development, but really allowing contracts for services to play this role that the airmail subsidies did. And while this seems somewhat difficult to achieve, given NASA's reluctance to do this historically, the current acting administrator of NASA recently suggested a similar thing in an interview. So it might not be too hard to imagine. So in sum, looking at the history of commercial aviation, a couple of things should stand out. There needs to be a central authoritative body, likely in the near future. A focus on regulations with an emphasis on safety will be necessary to establish individual and public faith in the endeavor. A need to build out infrastructure like SSA and traffic management, and a need to think strategically about how to use subsidies to build the commercial market and stimulate further demand. So it's not just about providing services that are necessary today, but how do we stimulate future demand for future services? So I think there's a lot of parallels here that are really interesting. It might be taking longer for commercial spaceflight to develop compared to commercial aviation. But in the next 50 to 100 years, it's not beyond thinking it to be possible. So I think it's wise to learn the lessons of commercial aviation to get a head start on preparing for what we might see with commercial spaceflight. Space is hard enough. So government should try to find ways to make it both safer and easier to do. So thank you all for allowing me to present, at least very, very virtually, asynchronously at that. And I hope to talk to all of you throughout the symposium this week. Thank you.